Welcome to the Real Python Podcast. This is episode 35. So, you built a web application in Python. Now, how are you going to authorize users? Security goes beyond authentication. It gets into who gets to do what, where, and when. This week on the show, we have Sam Scott, Chief Technology Officer from OSO. OSO is an open source policy engine for authorization that you embed in your Python application. Sam talks about the typical security and authorization challenges developers face. He discusses building an engine on top of your existing Flask or Django app. And he covers the concepts of policies, business logic, and some common paradigms. This episode is brought to you by the Techmeme Ride Home podcast, Silicon Valley's favorite daily podcast. Okay, let's get started. The Real Python Podcast is a weekly conversation about using Python in the real world. My name is Christopher Bailey, your host. Each week, we feature interviews with experts in the community and discussions about the topics, articles, and courses found at realpython.com. After the podcast, join us and learn real-world Python skills with a community of experts at realpython.com. Hey, Sam, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
To get a little background on OSO and your project, can you just tell us a little bit about what your project's doing and kind of the origins of it a little bit?
Yeah, so I guess I can kind of talk a little bit about how I started this out and where I came from.
Yeah, sure.
So prior to this, I was doing a PhD in cryptography. We actually used a fair bit of Python through Sage, early on, doing a bunch of kind of fun elliptic curve things using Sage. So that was really nice. And I was kind of having a lot of fun there. And I kind of came out of that PhD like looking kind of do something more practical in the real world. And the kind of interesting thing I saw was that there were all these problems out there in the real world that like from the academic view were like these like solved problems. I was like, wait, why are people these are solved problems? Why are people still struggling with them? And it's kind of because the view I saw was just like that the tooling out there was like so impossibly hard for everyone to use that like you had to have a PhD in cryptography to be able to work out what to do.
Sure.
And so this was like almost 3 years ago now. I was kind of like coming out and sort of going out and speaking to a bunch of people, like understanding the space better. So, sort of 6 months into that, I met up with my now co-founder, Graham. And he was coming from this like developer background. He was previously at MongoDB. And we just had this like incredible conversation over coffee about the state of the world of like security for developers. So this is, over 2 years ago now, we just clicked on this idea that like security shouldn't be so hard for developers.
Yeah.
And that's basically what we're out to do. That's like the very high level of like what OSO is all about is, putting security into the hands of developers.
Cool. So just to take you back a little bit, I'm not that familiar with Sage. Can you tell me a little bit what that was?
Yeah. So Sage is this maths package built entirely on top of Python with like a few, I don't know exactly the internals of it, but it has like a Python-like REPL, for example, but some of the syntax is like overloaded. So you can do things like, math operations like exponentiation easier, but it's, very much like using Python to do maths. You can like add and multiply matrices together using the syntax you expect in Python. It's this like very deep open source maths package. It was actually my entry point into open source. I dug up from like 9-10 years ago. It was my first open source contribution was this little piece of functionality in Sage Math.
Oh, cool. And so it's super popular for cryptography and all those types of things where you need those higher order levels of math.
Yeah, exactly. It's got very, very strong sort of number theory things in there, and I think just a few mathematicians kind of really picked up on it. There's a guy, Martin Albrecht, is one who got me into it early on, who has done a ton of incredible stuff around like lattice-based cryptography, which is now there's a huge push behind this, and there's like a NIST process towards the like post-quantum cryptography, and a lot of the analysis there has been done using Sage Math. So that's a pretty exciting area.
What's post-content cryptography?
Post-quantum cryptography.
Yeah, what is that?
So post-quantum cryptography is basically how do we do cryptography in a world where quantum computers exist?
Oh, okay. That's the next fear a lot of people have, right?
It's the next fear a lot of people have, and there's a US governmental department called NIST, which runs like a lot of the cryptography standards, and they have this really interesting perspective, which is if there is stuff that you're using today, which is using like classical cryptography, if there's a quantum computer in, say, 50 years, then like data encrypted today is not safe.
Right.
So they have that really like long view of things, right? Like if you want your health records encrypted today to be safe in 50 years, then maybe you need to start considering these things. So they're currently running a process to like try and standardize on algorithms to do that like next generation cryptography.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
So, what were some of the first steps you guys made in getting OSO started?
Yeah. So, I mean, the first thing we did is just went out and spoke to as many developers and security teams as possible, and really just were open to like hearing about the things they were struggling with. A lot of where we started out was around like how people think about managing secrets. I think that was very, very appealing to me from that cryptography background. It's like, okay, encryption is one thing, and post quantum and all this stuff, but like, what do you do with the key? Like, where do you put that stuff? And there's a bunch of products out there that help you manage those, but that's like to this day, I think something very painful for people. And so we kind of like we spoke to people, we heard about the struggles they had with doing things like encryption, but also authentication, authorization, stuff like auditing. And the one that kind of kept up time and time again was that people have been reinventing from scratch pretty much consistently. We've seen people building from scratch their own authorization and permission systems.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where we landed.
In that sort of stack of things that you were just mentioning there, it's kind of like there's authentication, and then you're diving into this other layer of authorization then, and that's the focus you're talking about. To take a step back, like what types of authorization work with OSO?
So absolutely any. So yeah, I mean, I can give a little overview as well on those kind of pieces, right? So
yeah,
there's kind of the classic paradigm, right? Is authentication is all about who you are. So I don't know, you think about using something like GitHub, right? You go and you enter your username and password. You maybe do some two-factor authentication or something. That is proving who you are to GitHub. They're like, okay, cool, you are now. I know you. You're Sam89, authenticated. Tick. So authorization would be like the next piece of that. It's like, okay, cool. Now I know who you are. Like, what can you do? Can you see this repository? Are you allowed to like push to it? Can you open a pull request? Like, are you in this organization, in this repository? Like all that kind of information is like, okay, I know who you are, but what can you do in the app? And so that's the area that we really focus on is that latter piece.
Yeah. Okay. And so the goal here is to alleviate using like a tool like Flask or Django to completely roll your own set of authorization levels and terms, right?
Yeah, that's right. So the interesting thing is like, so you asked earlier, right? What kinds of authorization can you represent in something like OSO? And there's kind of like two kind of main types of authorization people normally think about. There's roles and like role-based access control. The idea there being you sort of group both users and permissions into some kind of simple, easy to understand notion of like what someone can do. Like you're the owner of a repository. That means you can do a certain set of actions. And I don't need to tell you specifically the 100 different things you can do. You kind of have a sense of what that should mean. And maybe a collaborator has, some other kind of set of meanings.
Right.
And so that's kind of like one sense. And then there's this idea of like attribute-based access control, which is like, maybe it's, if the repository is public, anyone can see it. If it's private, then you're, depending on something else. Those are kind of like the two main paradigms. But, in reality, no implementation is ever that simple. There's always like these kind of weird edge cases where it's like, so you have, repository roles, but you also have, third-party plugins that need to be able to do stuff across like multiple repositories. And they're not really a collaborator. They're just like some additional functionality and they have different permissions. And so, basically what we've seen in the past is, people often will start out in something like Django or Flask with maybe some basic roles and they'll build it in one way. And over time, their app will kind of change and adapt and they need to support new things and stuff they hadn't predicted. And kind of very quickly, it stops being a model and just starts being a kind of a mess.
So going back a little bit, you're saying that a typical setup, I'm used to the idea of the roles, like kind of coming from a user perspective.
Yeah.
Maybe from a Django CMS kind of engine type of thing. But attributes would be more based upon kind of looking kind of from a different direction.
Yeah, kind of. And, I think often it comes down to not just like the role, it's like your relationship to the data.
Okay.
So, one thing that maybe comes up often is, in the context, maybe like creating issues. It's like, an admin of a repository can delete any issue they want, but users can only delete their own issues. And so there's kind of something a little bit deeper going on there. It's like, you need to have some kind of concept of like, this is my issue, I can delete it. It's not about if I'm a collaborator or not. It's like, no, but I was the creator of that issue.
Right. It's mine. Right.
Does that make sense?
Okay. So through that, you guys have developed what you guys are calling a policy engine. Is that a new term?
It's not entirely a new term, but I think it's kind of a relatively new way of thinking about doing authorization in an app.
Okay.
The idea of the policy engine really comes down to two pieces. So on one hand, there's the policy itself, which is representing all the authorization logic we were just kind of speaking about, right? So the idea that users can push to repositories they're a collaborator of. Like you might try and represent that logic in your policy in a declarative way. So it's like a series of rules. The idea of the policy engine piece of this is it kind of reads in all those policies. It will like store them internally inside like what's called a knowledge base, and you can then make queries against it. So you can ask questions of it, like what can this user do? Can they push to this specific repository? And the job of the policy engine is like taking that and based on everything it knows, deciding yes or no, or potentially even other things.
Okay. And the policy engine in this case is written in kind of a separate language, right?
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, basically, when we started out building this, we wanted to build something that could be used consistently across like any language.
Right.
And so, so Python is one of the languages we support. We also support, Ruby, Java, Node, and Rust. And basically, the last one on that sort of list which kind of stands out is Rust, and that's because the core of this is written in Rust. We built this entire language and the policy engine. That's all built in Rust and then exposed to those other languages through. In some cases, it's like a C-style interface, and in the case of Node, it's actually in WASM.
Okay. I spoke to Russell Keith McGee, a guy who created Beware, about that for a little bit, and he'd used that acronym before too. So that's the web assembly, is that right?
That's right, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's not like somebody needs to go in and program that themselves in Rust. That what they'll be doing is kind of creating descriptive elements inside of the policy, right?
That's right, yeah, exactly. So yeah, for a user, the interface is basically two things. It's you write your policies in the language called Polar, and then you use whatever your like language library is. It's pip install oso, and you can then do like oso load policies and then query away.
And they're saved in a, like if you were working inside of Django, it'd be saved away in a separate directory.
Yeah, exactly. So in the case of policy files, the way you should think of them is like code, right? So they, in the case of Django, for example, the OSO Django integration will expect them to live in a policy folder, and it will like load them from there. So it does all the things you expect Django to, in the same way that like fixtures would be loaded in or templates would be loaded in. It'll load them in on startup. It will reload the Django app if they change in debug mode, things like that.
Okay. One of the things that I was wondering about, use this term of not confusing authorization code with business logic.
Yeah.
Can you give an explanation a little bit of like what is considered business logic?
Yeah. So it's not always very clear cut. It's one thing. So like I think for me, like one sign that you've done like authorization really well is if like the user doesn't even know it's there. Like if it's not something the user ever sees, you've probably done it well, because then it means that they are happily using your app without needing to think about this, right?
They're not banging against it.
Exactly.
Okay.
In some cases, though, like the lines do get blurred. So I know, coming back to like the GitHub example, for example, you log into your profile page and maybe it shows all the repositories you're like a contributor to. In some senses, that's all the repositories you're like authorized to view, or is that fundamental business logic?
What would be another example of layers of business logic, like in a different type of app?
Other types of, sorry, what do you mean by that?
Well, like you mentioned briefly, healthcare.
Yeah.
What would be like examples of business logic there?
Yeah. So I mean, in healthcare. So imagine in a in a hospital using a piece of software, receptionists are entering, creating new appointments for patients. Doctors are entering stuff they know about the patient. Managing patient records. Updating them after they've had tests done, things like that. It's like in that sense, like entering all the information and viewing the information. That's all like core business logic. Where the authorization would come into that is maybe only your primary care physician is allowed to see your data, not just anybody at the hospital who can use the software.
Right. They might be able to send out forms, but they're not able to like access them after it or whatever.
Exactly.
Okay. How does it sometimes get tangled up then between authorization code and business logic?
Well, So a lot of the time, these things are they are very related, especially around the data they're kind of part of. So again, adding somebody as a collaborator to your repository is feels to me very much like the core part of GitHub. Or
Yeah, okay.
but it's sort of authorization logic is then based on that data. So the data has been entered as a core part of the business logic, but then authorization decisions are often made based on the business logic or the data that's been entered via the business logic.
What are ways that you can separate them more?
So, and that's kind of the idea of where OSO and the sort of policy engine comes in. And this was something that when we first started building it, we kind of was one of our core design principles is I think it all revolves around the data piece. So, the data existing in the application of a user is a member of a repository or the creator of this repository, they're an organization, that'll can stay as part of the app in the business logic, in the way the application's built.
So in that example, you'd be building that inside of Django itself. And
exactly. They are just your standard Django models. You have your user model, you have your repository model. The data is all just managed through Django. You build views and forms on top of that.
Yeah.
You can almost pretend the authorization doesn't exist.
Okay.
Done well, the authorization then just becomes this purely additional piece on top of it, where it can sort of take in all that information and make decisions based on it. And then you sort of can inject it in the right places, ideally as something like a middleware. And so that's kind of what we try to do it with OSO, basically. It's you can, in the case of Django, you can add it as a middleware. You can, there's a single authorize method you can call. That's just going to basically push the decision making to the policy engine and the policy logic. The policy itself, you can write over those Django models, over your application data itself. You can read attributes, you can call methods, you can type check based on the models. So all of that information that is expressed through how you've designed your models and schemas and all that gets to stay where it is. But you then get to make those decisions based on it.
When the New Yorker magazine asked Mark Zuckerberg how he gets his news, he said the one news source he definitely follows is Techmeme. Every day by 5 p.m., the Techmeme Ride Home has all the tech news you need. Listen to the one podcast anyone who's anyone in Silicon Valley listens to every single day. Search your podcast app now for Ride Home and subscribe to the Techmeme Ride Home podcast. You mentioned that you can just simply pip install it.
Yep.
So the software as it sits is open source, and people can use it without any, you don't have to pay any fees or anything. They have to check it out and hopefully help them add more security and to their applications, right?
Yeah, that's right. It's fully open source. Everything you can find in the repository. We have a little sort of growing community of people kind of involved in OSO, and actually kind of just earlier today having a really good conversation around the Django integration itself, talking about how to make it more idiomatic in the Django framework itself and how it works with kind of existing pieces Django has.
What was the word you used there? Did you say idiomatic or automatic?
Yeah, idiomatic. Yeah.
Okay. What do you mean by that?
For example, so Django does have a few of these kind of pieces in built into the framework, and it's kind of as a scaffolding for permissions.
Right.
So, for example, there is a kind of a common method built into sort of the Django auth model, which is around asking whether a user has a particular permission. There's this has perm method you can use.
Okay.
And if you implement that, basically, then other Django things built on top of it can use it. And so some of the feedback we got earlier today was well, if we provided out of the box OSO implementing that, so the has perm would be implemented through OSO, through the policy engine. Then it kind of just fits into this Django ecosystem without having people who are already building apps on Django on top of that can potentially just plug in OSO, and there's no more work for them to do.
So what are some issues that you have with supporting multiple platforms? Because you have, we mentioned Django multiple times here, but another popular platform would be Flask.
Yeah. So currently we have Django and Flask integrations. The challenge is there's kind of there's a long tail of stuff we could potentially do in every language as well as every framework to sort of make that experience better and better and better. The idea is in a lot of these cases we are reaping the benefits of having this single policy underneath the surface. So once we add a new language, the library on top of the language is kind of thin, and like the framework doesn't need to be too much. But it was definitely challenging. One of the challenges is just the kind of platform and the language support. Between the two, we have something like a couple of hundred CI jobs that run every time we do a release to check every Python version against every operating system and things like that.
Oh yeah, okay.
Yeah, that's been fun. Yeah, and so like in Python specifically, the process we go through is we compile the Rust core down to a dynamic library that gets like embedded into a Python wheel. And there's some nice tools around Python to do this like many Linux approach, so you can provide these pre-built Python wheels for different versions. But yeah, a lot of different versions to test out.
Yeah, we've been doing a deep dive over the last, I don't know, a couple months talking about packaging and the idea of like, getting your code ready for that kind of circumstances. So you guys are dealing, right on the front lines of that stuff. So
yeah.
And the support for, all the different flavors of Linux and stuff, I think could be pretty interesting because it's not a pure Python package.
Exactly. But we want people to have that experience, though. We want them to pip install it and be done, and not to have to think about compiling a Rust thing as part of it, for example.
Right. Okay. What are common security concerns that developers have?
Yeah, it's a great question. A lot.
Well, it's been a common question to me. It's like, can you bring people on about security? I'm like, okay. And they never really quite say exactly what concerns they have. I have overarching ones myself, but I'm wondering, like, what are the types of things that you guys hear?
Yeah, I mean, frankly, it's an overwhelming number. I think there's like a ton of things which is around security of, once your app is like running in production. I kind of mentioned managing secret keys earlier. You'll kind of need this pretty early on once you're like trying to deploy apps into production. But from like an application developer perspective, the kinds of things, a lot of it basically comes down to having this mindset of like, what is the worst? What could someone do who wants to use my app maliciously? What could they do inside the app?
Okay.
So, SQL injection is this like really common one that comes up time and time again, where you have some piece of user input, and if you don't, construct your query correctly, or if you don't sanitize that input, people can end up maybe making arbitrary SQL requests to your backend, which could mean, exposing data. It could mean dropping tables or things like that.
Right.
And
there's that XKCD comic, right?
Good old Bobby tables.
Yeah. Right. Okay.
And so this similar for authorization. It's like, authorization is, maybe if everyone behaved and used your web app like you expected to, maybe this wouldn't be a problem. But, if you're not careful, maybe the web app is making requests to the back end. And if you haven't done authorization on some of those pieces, someone can, they can observe what your web browser is doing, and maybe they can manipulate those things. Oh, look, it's asking for, repository 123. What if I change that to 234? Oh, it still works. Cool. I can get all that data.
Yeah, to do like kind of like just an attack just by looking at the way the structure is written.
Exactly. You can like see what the web app's asking for and see if you can work around it. And because it can be, as I said, it can be tough. Like if you feel like you've coded it, in a functional way. Like I want my users to use the app in some way. They need to have access to the data they need. But you need to be very careful of making sure you're checking all the right inputs. You're correlating these things. Like, does this user are they really allowed to do this thing? Like, it might not be possible for that to happen in a normal usage of the app, but what about in irregular usage of the app?
Okay. Are there a set of tools that you would suggest somebody use to test or harden their app?
There are some generally really good security tools out there for some set of problems. I have to say I've been playing around with Snyk a bit recently, SNYK.
Okay, that's the one I keep hearing. Yeah.
For doing like the checking your dependencies and vulnerabilities in that. I think that's a huge piece. Because that's even worse. That's not even your code. That's someone else's code has got a problem, and now you're vulnerable.
Yeah.
I think for authorization specifically, it's sadly an area which I don't think has seen as much love, which is kind of why we exist, right? But
okay.
Today, the best practices for that is do as much testing as possible, manual security audits, people manually coming through a code base trying to see if there's somewhere that they haven't added authorization. So that's kind of the state of things, which is, obviously one of the things we're trying to solve with OSO is making that easier.
And in some ways, having it as a separate policy engine, this separate piece of software, is that in some way making it more secure?
Yeah, well, so it's kind of two pieces. So the library itself, like, again, like the Django, the Flask one, you can use it to make sure that every request is authorized in some way. So you can have that designed by default. You can make sure that everything has authorization, and that's very noticeable because like you use the app and it'll be broken.
Right.
And the kind of the nice thing about having the like authorization logic written in that policy is it just gives you that like one place to check, to look, to see what's being implemented. It's not a case of like hunting through the code base, as I said, checking every view, every route to make sure that authorization's been applied. It's deny it by default and then look at the policy to understand what the logic is.
Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Kind of coming from the other side, what are security concerns that the users have kind of, trying to use these types of things?
So, I mean, I think nobody wants to get their data stolen,
right?
Which is obviously a kind of sadly common thing these days, which isn't always about authorization, right? But that can definitely be one area that comes up. So, no one's happy when there is a security breach of some form. But I think, again, coming back to something I said earlier, the users don't want to have to spend a ton of time like understanding your internal permissions structures just so they can use your app. This is when you often get to the there's like 20 different roles to choose from. There's like a giant 20 by 20 matrix of permissions. Sort of hunting through, like trying to understand. Well, do I need this set? Maybe not this set. Like, I think that often gets very common in some of these kind of like larger B2B or enterprise apps that do have a lot of complexity, and unfortunately a lot of places find it hard to get that right and end up just kind of pushing that work back to the users. And
right, so then they have to have like a whole like instruction
Yep.
session with people to get them onboarded or what have you.
Yep. And that's where I've heard many stories of people having like an Excel spreadsheet, for example, to try and track who has access to what and all these kind of things. And that the kind of thing that 5 seconds after you wrote is out of date. And then and things like that. Yeah.
Okay. What are some of the worst security issues you've found in a Python app?
Yeah. So I think I may have mentioned one that last time we spoke, which maybe isn't the worst in the grand scheme of things, but I think is definitely interesting, which was that someone had managed to miss. They'd managed to miss doing authorization on one of the endpoints, which was the endpoint to delete a user account. And
oh boy.
Yeah, it meant that users could just delete other people's bank accounts.
Oh my gosh.
It's easily done though. It's interesting though. I had a founder of a company kind of confide in me once, saying that they had a pretty terrible security issue, and I can't really go into the details of it, but apparently after they had this massive security issue, they started getting a lot more interest from companies who are like, welcome to the club. Sort of everyone's had one, like you sort of now you've cut your teeth in the real world. We can trust to make sure you'll take security seriously now.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah. I don't know. I keep seeing these goofy Twitter things lately. Like, is coffee not enough to wake you up? And they're like, okay, delete a table in production, or some kind of ridiculous thing. It's like, all right, now you're awake.
Yeah. Email all our customers because we've released their data. Yeah, that sounds like a good one.
Right. Kind of going back to that idea of endpoints, is there a way that you can audit all your endpoints?
Not without extensive testing currently.
Okay.
I mean, there are apps that will do they can do some sort of vulnerability testing in sort of checking for like kind of more like the SQL injection style things, or checking the kinds of inputs that it accepts.
Yeah.
But yeah, right now it's very much a sort of manual approach. It's kind of the best people know.
Yeah, I've used some different like form software things that help with the whole sanitizing thing, then try to help with checking to make sure they're not entering arbitrary code versus actual like user input that you're looking for.
Yeah, I think that the challenging thing is it's implementing the test for those is almost as much work as like writing the policy itself. It's like you're kind of to know what to test for, you're basically having to take that whole policy and like rewrite it as a test suite. everybody might, for example, everyone can see the homepage, but the data that's displayed on that is like where the policy maybe comes into it. It can be hard to say, all right, so yes, this has, we check, we authorize they're allowed to view the page, but like, what about the data that's on the page and so on? But we have some interesting ideas on how we could do this better. Actually, we were just talking about earlier today. Should be excited to show sometime soon, hopefully.
This week, I want to shine a spotlight on another Real Python video course. It's titled Exploring HTTPS and Cryptography in Python. The course is based on a Real Python article by Logan Jones. The instructor for the course is previous podcast guest Christopher Trudeau, and he takes you through the various factors that combine to keep communications over the internet safe. You'll see concrete examples of how a Python HTTPS application keeps information secure. In the course, you'll learn how to monitor and analyze network traffic, apply cryptography to keep data safe, describe the core concepts of public key infrastructure, or PKI, create your own certificate authority, build a Python HTTPS application, and identify common Python HTTPS warnings and errors. I think learning the fundamentals of HTTPS and cryptography in Python is a crucial skill for anyone interested in building applications for the web. And like most of the video courses on Real Python, the course is broken into easily consumable sections and has code samples for the techniques shown. It also includes a shiny new transcript and closed captions. Check out the video course. You can find a link in the show notes, or you can find it using the newly enhanced search tool on realpython.com. What are common other gotchas that happen in developing these kinds of applications around authorization?
So where things can get really tricky is there's often a time in the life of a B2B company where they end up needing to support some kind of custom roles. It's kind of happens to any B2B company that hits a certain size. It's like, all right, we have some large customer who really, really wants to have fine-grained control inside our app. So we should let them create their own roles and assign permissions. And what can happen there is that inevitably the customer will come up with some set of permissions that make sense to them, but just completely breaks your application. It's like, you should be able to, view repositories, but not see any of the contents of them. And suddenly you're like, but what's the point of that? And you're like, well, I don't know. We want someone to be able to read the names, but not the code. And now you're in a situation where your app is just like, I don't know how to handle this.
Yeah. They've created some kind of junior administrator kind of role or something that.
Yeah, exactly. Something like that. So that, and that's where people often just start just adding in all these exception cases. Like, okay, but in this particular mode, let's just get rid of all. Let's do something custom.
Is it literally like walking down like a if then kind of or if else kind of statement?
Okay. Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
Actually, on that topic, I think the idea of having a God user or a super user or something like that is a very common pattern. The idea that you just every now and then maybe you need someone like a support engineer or a developer who's debugging something to be able to go in and just sort of say, I just kind of need full power because I need to go and make sure everything is working like it is. And that there's often a very maybe it's a simple, as you say, if statement early on, but later on you kind of realize that that's not ideal to be able to give people that much power, and you sort of have to then kind of backtrack a little bit and rein it in, and maybe have some checks in place, why are they doing these things? And I guess if you're familiar with the kind of the incident that Twitter had recently, which was that internal user credentials could do quite a lot of things.
Yeah, that was kind of a little shocking to lots of people.
But Twitter has a fantastic engineering team, right? That's not I'm sure that's not based on anyone's lack of engineering experience or prowess. It's just these are decisions that you can make early on that can often be super, super hard to get away from if you don't do it right.
Yeah, that makes sense. Kind of on that theme, what are other ways that authorization gets kind of tied up in knots and complicated?
Yeah, so I
don't know if you can think of another type of application system,
Yeah, so I'm thinking of one. So there's So the idea of having the authorization logic separated from the the application code, the business logic, isn't a new one. And so there are like other people who've gone down this path of, maybe adding like something like a Python decorator to all your methods or routes that like, maybe will list like the role you need to be able to call this method or something like that. That can be sort of nice, but then like we've seen companies who, multiple years down the line have 3,000 of these methods with just like all of these decorators spread throughout, and that can be super hard to move away from that. And the problem is, like, as I kind of said, maybe earlier, like just using roles isn't enough. So you end up with, it's like, take the example I gave earlier, which is like you can delete your own comments, but if you're a user of admins can delete anyone's comments. If all you have is roles, the way you might solve that is having two different endpoints, like delete own comment or delete other users' comment, and you're going to assign roles to those two things. And so that's kind of one of the ways that, like, if you start out with roles, you're going to end up starting doing sort of slightly unnatural things in your application to kind of work around that limitation. And once you've gone down that route and you have like 3,000 of these things, it's going to be super hard to justify doing some sort of refactor to try and like pull all of that out and rewrite it.
Have you been in a situation where you've had to do that?
We have, we were in a conversation with a company who was looking down that kind of process.
And you just look at the code and your eyes glaze over as far as like, how am I going to unwind this?
Yeah. So in one of these cases, it wasn't quite. There's a different example I'm thinking of now, which is where that same logic was expressed through multiple like CSV files.
Okay.
And so it was all like very these like long thousand line CSV files and some XML things as well.
So that had to be read in at the time to sort of calculate what things are what.
Yeah, exactly. And so that was kind of like one of the fun things we helped them out with was slurping up all those CSVs and trying to convert them into some somewhat nicer policies they could use instead. That was actually kind of a nice one because it was already data driven, so they actually had a reasonable path to move from that to policies. But if you have the equivalent but in code, it's, as far as I'm aware, there's not like a sort of batch Python refactoring tool that you could use to do something similar.
Yeah. We spoke a little bit about the development process. I guess maybe if you want to dive a little deeper into it, like what are you guys working on currently? And I know you guys have a little bit about the website. We could talk about the blog and some of the other resources you guys provide also.
Yeah, absolutely. So there was one of the things we're most excited about at the moment, we wrote a blog post on recently, is this idea of, which we're kind of calling list filtering. And so what this looks like in the case of like the Django application, Django integration specifically, is this idea that you can write your policies, you write your polar policies, and you kind of express the logic you want for authorization. And the auto policy engine will convert those, like on making so like on querying that policy, instead of just making a yes or no decision, it'll actually output a set of like Django RM filters for the database. So that if you have, for example, like millions of entries in your database, and you want to like say, give me all of the rows that this user can see, your logic still stays in that policy, but it gets like kind of compiled down to a query and done like super efficiently in the database. So this has been a big feature we've been working on recently that we wrote up in a blog post for how that looks like in Django.
So that's all kind of, it all pops out just as like part of an ORM statement that you can then add the things that you need to it for logic.
Yeah. Exactly. So in the case of, in the Django integration, you basically just works as like a records manager thing. So you can say like, repositories.objects.authorized, and it will just return you just the query set of the ones you're authorized to read.
Okay.
And so that's really fun because it's so like this, the main development for this has all been done at the Rust level. We're making these improvements to the language itself to allow it to sort of output a set of constraints instead of just a yes no decision. You can say like, what repositories can I access? And I'll say, well, repositories where you are the owner or you have this role or so on, so on, so on. And so like we modify that internal policy engine to return something different to yes no to these constraints. And you can use that for like other things like this list filtering problem. But you can do this across like all languages is the nice thing.
We didn't speak about it much, but what does writing in Polar look like?
It's kind of like writing Python, but a little bit different. Yeah.
Okay.
So the language polar itself is based on Prolog. It's like this classical logic programming language. And so it is it's a decorative, it's a logical programming language. So you write, instead of writing the code like imperatively, you kind of write the end state. The idea of it being like decorative or logical, you kind of write what you expect to be the end output. So you say, I want to allow a user to read a repository. That would be like the top of the rule. It kind of looks like the method. And you say if user.id equals repository.owner.id.
Okay.
And so you kind of just write that statement. And the syntax for this this is the bit where it kind of looks like Python. The syntax looks sort of similar to Python. You can do user.id to look at an attribute. You can, if you need to have multiple of these, you can do X and Y or Z, and it's spelled out like Python. You can call methods, stuff like that.
So it's got like a dot notation syntax somewhat.
Exactly. And, the rule, which kind of looks like a method, has like type parameters, which kind of look like Python type parameters. The only difference is you don't express like how, you don't need to express how like OSO needs to go through that information. You just kind of write down everything you want, all the rules, you put them all down. And the idea is that the policy engine is the one that searches through that rules, like combines them together, works out, is this true? If so, I'll move on to the next thing. So you don't write down the control flow. That's all done through the policy engine.
Yeah, that sounds nice. Save you a lot of effort on that.
Yeah, it's definitely like a new paradigm. It takes a little bit for the sort of everything to just kind of click into place because it's a bit different to what people are used to. But what we've kind of heard time and time again is, maybe after like using it for maybe an hour or two, you have this moment where you're just like, oh, right, I get it. And, all the things that you were, the reason there's no like if else statements because like, that's, it's written this way and it's all like flat. I don't have these like nested statements because, and it's kind of like this moment where you see people like, oh, I don't need to like tell it how. It just.
Are there like paradigms that people use for certain types of authorization structures? Like I can think of like this is me thinking, in SQL and tables and the whole idea of like database architecture. But I feel like authorization has a similar idea of like, okay, well, what are ways that roles can be organized that somebody would think about in advance?
Yeah. So there's a couple of like very common ones, especially with roles. So you might have role hierarchies. So like, kind of like concentric circles of permissions almost, like a guest can do one thing, a member can do everything a guest can do plus additional things, and an admin can do everything a user can do plus additional things. So like often you might have that kind of hierarchy, which, in OSO, for example, you can write it that way so you don't need to like repeat yourself again and again. A similar one is like role inheritance.
Okay.
This one can be super, super powerful. So, well, first of all, the idea of like having roles associated to a particular resource. I've said this a bunch without kind of explaining it right, but like an owner of a repository or a member of an organization, these are like roles associated with a particular thing, organization, repository, project, whatever it is. And so role inheritance, which is like a super powerful piece, is to be able to say, if I am an owner, if I'm a member of an organization, I can be a member or a collaborator of any repository in that organization.
Okay.
And so this is the kind of thing that we've got a bunch of examples on the website for, which is like, you can write exactly that in like 2 lines of Polar code.
Yeah, I think about those kinds of things where like having to restructure that, especially if you've done it already, like say in your Django code or whatever, could be part of the frustrations we've been speaking about already. But like just being able to sit down in advance and look at some models of examples, I think would help people a lot.
Yeah. We also, so we actually had the chance to do a little workshop with the Python Atlanta meetup folks like last week, where we kind of went through some of this, and actually we have some of the materials of that like available on our GitHub as well.
Cool.
Which is nice. It like walks you through navigating these concepts from a pure like Django perspective, like what are Django groups and what does Django admin give you? And then like starting to bring in some of those like authorization concepts, like, okay, cool. Like what happens if we have, assign permissions to a group member? Like what does that look like from a logic standpoint?
Nice.
Yeah.
I know we kind of hit on the development process a little bit here and there.
Yep.
Do you want to go a little further into that too? Like,
there's some, yeah. So I touched on one of them briefly earlier, which is around being able to, write some, more concise tests around checking whether you've, done the right access controls in place. One of the things we're looking at now actually is providing a lot more sort of out of the box templates for some of the models we've spoken about. Like if you want to get started with roles in your app in, under 5 minutes,
yeah,
we're kind of, looking at providing code that people can basically drop into their Django app and get running. And then like over time, if they want to do some of the stuff we spoke about today, like they'll all be compatible with OSO and they can just like build on top of that.
Okay. So just like another version of templating.
Yep.
Okay.
It's just, again, we find, people, often people come and ask us, around like, what is the right way to do, how should they do authorization permissions in their app? And I think it kind of speaks to that worry that, what you build today is probably going to sit there for a good couple of years before you maybe get frustrated and try and rip out the whole thing. And so
right.
we're really interested in setting people off on the right path of that. Actually, at this point, I could advertise as well that I actually hold weekly office hours on Thursdays if people like interested in talking about how they do authorization in their app, whether it's OSO related or not. That's the kind of thing I'm always happy to talk to people about.
Okay. I have a couple questions that I ask weekly, recurring questions. I know you work with a variety of languages, but it sounds like you've done quite a bit of work in Python.
Mm-hmm.
So what is something that you're excited about that's happening in the world of Python?
So I'm very excited about, we're going to be at Python Universe in sort of a few weeks, probably on the 19th of November. That one should be a lot of fun. There's a lot of really interesting talks there, actually.
Yeah, this should be right before that.
Yeah. And there's some other interesting talks actually on authentication authorization there. Should be interesting.
Cool. Oh, where does that take place? I mean, I'm guessing online mostly, but
yeah, exactly. It's going to be a global web summit. I think it's across time zones. They got slots to kind of cover the full 24 hours. So that should be fun. They got a couple of tracks.
Is that an ongoing thing? I'm not familiar with it.
I'm not sure. I'm not familiar with it actually. I'm not sure. I think
okay.
I think it was a previous event which they're doing a sort of global version of for these interesting times.
Yeah, I was talking to Al Swagger about this whole idea of virtual conferences and the idea of kind of developing a curriculum around them.
Yeah.
Like a way to structure them that you could watch them in an order across, maybe multiple years and so forth. And I could imagine this kind of, like having multiple things about security kind of lining up would be useful as a structure. Like, okay, well, this is, like some of the fundamentals, and then these are the more advanced kind of concepts. And
yeah. So they've got like 2 tracks, for example, for like the beginner and advanced, which I think suits that well. Just more generally, I've been really loving we've been able to go to like a ton of different Python meetups because so much of them turned online. I mentioned Python Atlanta. We did Python SF as well, like about a month ago. It's been kind of fun to travel the world of Python without leaving my apartment, meeting a bunch of people all over. That's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, that's cool. So if somebody has a meetup group, you guys be interested in talking with them?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think we're
okay.
Should be a DC Python coming up soon as well. Should be fun.
All right, great.
Yeah.
That sounds fun.
Yeah. So other than that, stuff that I'm excited about in the Python ecosystem, I think, I'm really excited to see the kind of interoperability story through. I mean, I mentioned WebAssembly and WASM earlier. I think there's a really interesting story there, or just the kind of stuff we've been doing using like Rust and adding it to Python. I think we're going to start seeing a lot more of like kind of cross-language interop happening over the next few years. I wouldn't be surprised to see people embedding pieces of Python into performance critical and apps running in Go or something, microservice apps running in Go, but with like a little piece of Python in there for customization. And I think there's some really exciting stuff coming out that's just going to make choosing a language less of a thing. It'll just be more like everything kind of fits in together. Because that has been a lot of fun for us, is like building this pretty deep policy engine language thing in Rust, but working with it at the Python level I think has been a ton of fun. And so I'm excited to see more of that kind of thing come out.
Yeah, I am too. I'm very interested in that. He was talking a lot about the WebAssembly, the idea of, the idea of behind Beware's idea of, write it once and hopefully deploy it everywhere.
Yeah.
And the web has always been one of those kind of question marks. I mean, obviously, we've already been talking a lot about Flask and Django, but the idea of having a graphical built-in interface and not having to, create all those things yourself in multiple other languages would be kind of neat, and being able to build a framework around it. And the way, you guys are doing the same thing, the idea of like, we can attach these secure tools to your, your development platform of choice, which is cool.
Yep.
Yeah. So what's something that you want to learn next? And that could be in Python or otherwise.
Funnily enough, Fast API is something that's come up, I don't know, 3 or 4 times in like the last week for some reason. And obviously we're, always interested in like looking at new places where it can be added. And I think they do a fair amount of stuff with types, which I'm a big fan of. So I think that's one I might need to check out sooner rather than later.
Yeah. Michael Kennedy talked about that quite a bit when he came on the show
a
month or so ago. And it seems like I keep hearing it again and again. So
yeah, exactly.
I'll probably have to reach out to the people from Fast API and get them on to talk. So
that sounds good. Let me know if you do.
Oh, yeah, I will. Well, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing OSO with us.
Thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Don't forget to subscribe to the Techmeme Ride Home podcast. I want to thank Sam Scott for coming on the show. And I want to thank you for listening to the Real Python podcast. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast in your favorite player. And if you like the show, leave us a 5-star rating and a review. You can find show notes with links to all the topics we spoke about inside your podcast player or at realpython.com/podcast. And while you're there, you can leave us a question or a topic idea. I've been your host, Christopher Bailey, and I look forward to talking to you soon.